We'll pretend everybody doesn't know anything. In one way, we won't make any pretenses. We'll just say outright this is an ongoing series of talks on mysticism. The mythology just happens to be a good way to get at that. And by mysticism, we mean the modern generic term mysticism, which we take to mean looking at life or looking at reality from within out, knowing that within us is a part of the truth that is within all things. Oh, I can hardly read. Why am I? Writing is so tiny. We'll look a little bit at what mysticism is and what we're trying to do and catch ourselves up to what we have been doing so that we can do all kinds of other things. With regard to looking at life either from without or from within, Rudolf Steiner has a very interesting statement that has to do with coming to knowledge about things. Steiner's claim was that to know the truth about the world, you look within yourself. But to know yourself, you look outwardly into the world. And that seems to be really a good way to do things. In some ways, to a way they would never admit it, modern material scientists have certainly done the first clause of that. To know the world, they have looked within themselves in a way that they would never guess. Because if you think about all of science as we have it now, as empirical and inductive as it is, no scientist can ever say that they can prove any single element of science. They can't prove any theory, and few would even dare to say that they have seen anything like a causal connection. They just can't do it. All of it is within the scientist. Even what mathematical system and formulae to apply to the observations, it's all within the scientists. And if the scientists didn't agree, there wouldn't be any science. It's really quite interesting, because if you ask the scientists, they say they're seeing the truth that's out there in the things, but the reality is that it's all inside of them. The objectivity of science is also located inside of the scientists. What is so humorous about it is the fact that almost every scientist that I know of would denounce mysticism in ridiculing terms and say that there's really nothing to it. But when it comes right down to it, their language becomes mystical. The whole outlook is like that. The mystic chooses a much different perspective. The mystic more chooses to apperceive the truth within, the meaning of reality, and to voluntarily and vigorously refocus the attention of consciousness within to watch the experience of knowing. And the mystic full well realizes what the scientist ignores, and that is that the unity between all things and even the unity of what is communicated, the truth that is in all things is also in the truth knower. And despite our exile into separation and very personal living, if we refocus our attention inwardly, we can begin to awaken to the world of meaning and the world of truth and the world of the creative stuff that is behind everything that is in existence, which is every bit as much of a world as to focus outward. Clearly, it looks like it would be much healthier, and the modern mystic does follow this healthy regime, to have both streams of consciousness. One can't only be introvertive, one must also be extrovertive. And as much as there is a turning inward to seek the truth of things, there is a realization among mystics that when one is in touch with the divine, that divine is creative. And it needs expression, and so there is as much extroversion of giving self and truth from within to go outward onto the world. All of what we're saying sounds very nice and very tidy and very pretty, but all of it is still circumlocution. Because anybody who's ever turned within knows that it's much more demanding and it's much more difficult. Sometime to turn the attention inward, it would seem that our consciousness, for all of its quickness, when we want to say a sarcastic phrase or something like that, to turn the consciousness inward sometimes is like turning turgid concrete. It's not an easy matter. And it's really very simplistic to say that mysticism means looking at the world from within. For at least 5 years now, I have been very seriously thinking about that word and what that word means in the reality of myself. Within. What does it mean to be within? I'm not going to go into what I have derived from that. It'll come out along the way. But it is not easy to know how do you turn within yourself. You can close your eyes and you can look at what you think is inward, but there is always something within and behind your consciousness. We realize that sometimes when we are in a state where we're having insight, we realize that behind where our consciousness is functioning now, there's another part of our being that is watching and in an ever quiet way is creating things that are very exciting to our consciousness. And probably within and behind that is yet another state. But what it means to actually get within and to refocus our consciousness is not a simple matter. If you can say within means just to go within yourself. And that all sounds very pretty, but that still is beating around the bush. And when it comes to living the truth, knowing the truth, and being the truth, you can't beat around the bush. You have to be, there are no lies in it. And so it's easy to say that, well, you're just looking inside of yourself. That's what always comes up as the first thing. But then you say, what is yourself? And you can hear a lot of things about self. Like if you look in the history of philosophy, looking at the Buddhists and the Hindus, and looking at the history of Western philosophy, there are lots of lovely notions about what self is. I don't have any argument with any of them, but it is not the same thing as living and experiencing it. Or if you go to psychology and you look to people like Freud and especially Jung, They give great insight into the psychological nature of self, something that you can empirically see almost in the way people address their personality. But it still is not really consciously, wakingly experiencing self. I've read descriptions that I certainly can't argue with. There's a lovely one on the shelf here called Gods in Exile. And it's a description of a man who has a spiritually self-conscious awakening in the transcendent realms. And he knows himself like never before. And it's hair-raising to read it. But I can't say that really, I don't have any arguments with it, but I can't say for me that I know what self is. Even what Steiner says in the second clause of his phrase, that to know self, you look outward in the world, I have no trouble with that at all. I can take almost any subject or object in nature, and I can study it, and I can think about it, and I can write an essay about it, and sure enough, I know something about myself that I never knew before. I can look at that essay and say, wow, that is what I have always felt about that, and that's really what myself is about that. But that's sort of after the fact. You know what I mean? That's not living in self right here and now. They're all very, very lovely, but they certainly aren't what the Puranas say, for example, about contemplating the highest self and having complete union with God in the highest level. So it is not, what we're talking about in this class is not all completely from awakened experience. So several things should be apparent about the class and what we're doing. That the class will indeed be mystical. They will be of an inward nature. Hopefully they'll be objective and clear so that we can all benefit. The second thing that is obvious is that even though I'm doing the talking, it doesn't mean that I am an accomplished mystic. I'm certainly making no claims to any superphysical experience or tools or knowledge or anything like that. And even if I did, I wouldn't talk about it. And above all things, I'm certainly not a spiritual teacher. Instead, it's something much more like the Gnostics. Some of the Gnostics were spiritual schools, and some of them had practices that were most unusual. Every day, anyone who belonged to the cult could stand up and give a talk on the truth. Even if it was somebody that had only been in for a day or so, and even if it was somebody who was a steward in the kitchen, everybody had their day. This is why a lot of Gnostic writings and such like that are difficult, because there are so many different viewpoints, even, like from the Basilidians or Ophites or whatever group, Valentinians, whatever group, they had as many opinions as they had people, because they were very democratic and they thought everybody had the right and the duty to express the truth. So I'm every other Thursday, and that's the way it goes. Because these things flow out of a contemplation within, and because they come from self, or that which is within self, they share the consciousness of self and what is beyond. And that is, even in a very minimal way, all of us, me included, have a little touch of God. And anything that comes from that is likely to be creative, because everything that is divine is creative. And so this will be, there will be a lot of things that will sometimes be peremptory and speculative, and sometimes there will be blunders of inexperience and all kinds of other personal imperfections having to do with me, but they will be live and they will be fresh, and I'll try to stand by everything that is said here, and if it falls, it falls. Hopefully everything, because though it may not seem like it outwardly to any or everyone, I really am trying to live the truth as I understand it within, and I'm trying to do so very sincerely. So hopefully things will be alive and they will be relevant and fresh, and they won't be just so much intellectual talkings about things. Hopefully it'll relate to our times we're living now. And that brings us to a little closer to where we were trying to get. That brings us to history. I like this. It's going to be introduction on introduction on introduction. History. It has always been the case that what is spoken of in mythology, or what is pointed to in mythology, is the basis for creative life. And the manifestation of that creative life becomes history. So since we're talking about mythology, we're using mythology as a vehicle to be in touch with what it points to. And from that, everything comes into existence. It is especially important in our times that we get in touch with that, because rightly so, mythology is disappearing. And I am one of the first people that wants it to disappear. And that's part of the purpose of these talks, is to talk through mythology to what mythology points to. And we once get a view of that, we'll be in love with that, and we can let the mythology go and look at the spiritual reality. Everything issues from one. It's difficult, if you think handling complexity like an air controller handles complexity is difficult, handling simplicity is even more difficult. It's a much different order of difficulty. And understanding the one in and of itself without comparing it to anything, and without flinching, that is, looking God in the eye, and that eye is itself truth in light, is not an easy matter. The simplicity is in oneness. There is one. That could be enough for a talk right there. Everything on all the different levels of existence are crystallized or precipitated within that oneness. And within the one of pure spirit, that unity, since it is indeed a universe, has to be maintained at every level. On each level, there is a unity in cause and consequence. If I kick the chair, I get a toe. I get a sore toe. There is immediate cause and consequence. Between the different levels, unity is maintained through analogy. And that is that in some way the one replicates itself on level after level in an analogous fashion, so that the oneness of God is found analogously on all different planes and levels of existence. This is called the principle of analogy, and it was most beautifully stated by about a 7th century classicist writing on the topic of alchemy, saying, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. So, all of the realization of the unity of the different planes of existence, that what happens in us emotionally is parallel to what happens in us mentally, and that there is something similar, something analogous. Seers, who are indeed accomplished mystics, have stated that our individual lives, the life of the world, the life of the cosmos, and everything in it, all of those lives are acted out in heaven before manifest on earth. That doesn't mean that, that in spirit that there is, that we have houses and streets and things like that, but all of the principles or all of the qualities and all of the deeper spiritual morals that we're learning through experience in this life, not only us, but the world and everything in it, is according to a drama that is lived out in heaven before it is manifest on earth or in our little lives or even in the life of a bug or an atom or something like that. This is why, for example, prophecy works, like biblical prophecy. That usually biblical prophecy is told in almost mythical types of terms. That it's told like a story, and then the detail of how it works out later on is something much different. It's something down to earth. Now this whole idea of manifest reality being an expression of a transcendent cosmic drama is something that has many applications. We can see it in a simple sense in the evolution of culture. There is a British barrister named Owen Barfield, who was a friend of barrister, I know. I didn't have to. She gave me the glance. That was enough. She said, I told you once, that should be enough for you to know. And he wrote a lovely book called Romanticism Comes to Age, or Comes of Age. And it shows it shows the evolution of myths into other vehicles of culture, right down to things like the modern cinema and things like that, though it mostly focuses on poetry. That's one of the manifestations of this principle, but it is a simple one. The psychologists, especially Carl Jung, is very clear in saying that our lives are psychodramas living out archetypal ideas that are in the soul and that are reflected in mythical stories, in which he would call the collective unconscious. And it's much more even than saying that an astrologer is saying that life is expressed in the moment of birth. which unites the greater cosmos with a little life, and all of the mythical stories are built into, or quite a few of them are built into the little life, and it ties together mathematics and mundane reality, unites all sorts of things like this. All of these things are beautifully true, but they are much eclipsed by an even greater truth, and that is that evolution and creation of everything in history is of that cosmic drama. But again, it is something like the drama is going on all the time. The divine beings that represent divine truths exist, and their existence is active and not just passive, and their life is constant life, and that constant life is poured into a very rare transcendent universe. And in that very rare transcendent universe, the lives of all the spiritual beings are constantly being emanated and are being reborn perpetually. And so if we could have that kind of spiritual vision of a transcendent reality that is from where the stuff of self comes from, we would be aware of almost a Babylon of many, many truths all emanating at the same time. And what we call creation and what we call evolution and everything that is in the history of the creation, be it a little act or the creation with a capital C, is just one line of consciousness, of waking consciousness, cutting across this perpetual existence or this perpetual drama that always lives. And as it cuts across there is a delineation. Even that delineation may be multidimensional and it may have very different qualities about it, but in the divine, all of the stories are present all of the time. We're at a time now where this is becoming accessible to us. One of the consequences, as stated very beautifully by Carl Jung, of becoming materialistically separated is that we had to precipitate symbols as a gateway between the spiritual and the material. And that when we are focused in the material, we understand some of the life of the spiritual through the vehicle and nature of the symbol. Or when we are in the spiritual, we understand the material through that gateway. Unfortunately, Carl Jung wanted symbols to persist. And in fact, quite a bit of his entire philosophy and psychology is based on that. The mysteries teach and have taught for a long time that we are coming to a time that when, via the symbol, we can recognize the truth behind it, and when we develop perception to such an extent of the external world that what is within us is so much in touch with what we're perceiving that we begin to see through things, then the symbolic element can be dropped and we can see the kingdom of the gods face to face. And it is in that spirit that these talks are offered, that we're going to try and understand mythology relative to our history so that we can see through them and come to the living truth behind it. Scientists are correct in trying to abolish or outlive myths, and they're very right in doing that, only they haven't gone far enough so as to include their own activities. So that it turns out that much of science is itself a symbolic framework that is not in touch with the very things that it's pointing to. If we can experience the essence of the myths, the life of the myths, that is, if we can find the moral of the story in ourselves and live it in our lives, then a course like this is successful. Now we'll come to another introduction. This is a course in mysticism in the classical sense of the word mysticism. If you remember 4 years ago, we looked at myths used by the mystery schools. And among those myths that we looked at was the myth of Demeter and Persephone. And we looked at that myth in relation to the Eleusinian mysteries, which were celebrated in the woods outside of Athens annually. And we noted that at that time there were 2 classes of candidates for initiation. The first class, who were undergoing the purification by sacrifice and by silence and by fasting, were called mystae. They were called the hearers of the truth because all they did was hear it. After a year or so, and continued exercise and purification, they went and became seers of the truth, at which time they were known as epopte or epopte or ephori. It's an interesting thing that the Greek mysteries are opposite of the Christian mysteries, because in the Greek mysteries they took hearing as hearsay. You can only hear this, you can't see it yet. And then on the second step you got to see for yourself. In the Christian mysteries it goes the other way around. A lower degree of initiation is where you can see things and you see the truths and you see them with the light of feeling. But when you get on a deeper level, you hear, meaning you with the inner ear, you intuitively hear and have the truth spoken to you. This is reflected in the 2 Gospels of Luke and John. It says very clearly at the beginning of both Gospels that Luke's Gospel is clearly a gospel for people who are seers of the truth, whereas John's Gospel is for hearers of the truth. And each of the Gospels goes successively deeper. The genealogical Matthew's Gospel is for the physical body. The healing of the physical body, but very much like it, only more lively, is what Mark's Gospel is like. That's the healing Gospel through the ethers. And then Luke's Gospel is for the desire nature, for the desire body and the feelings and what people call the astral light. And finally, the Gospel that is for the mind deep behind it all is John's Gospel. It is from this former term, mystae, that the word mysticism comes from. According to people who seem to be true mystics and who seem to be exponents and speakers for the mysteries that seem to be valid, and very few people that I trust as valid, but I'm thinking now of people like Madame Blavatsky and Max Heindel and Rudolf Steiner. They all seem to agree that the mysteries were begun in a very ancient period of time when we were much different than we are now, and that period of time was called Atlantis. We, in our consciousness, we won't talk about form, which is what almost always other people talk about, we in our consciousness were at that time much more innocent. And we were much more spiritually inclined because our slide down the slope of materialism and sinful egoism had not proceeded so far. This slide was a consequence of a fall. That is an event in a much earlier period of time, which is designated by the term Lemuria, when we chose experience over the meaning of experience for selfish desire for immortality. And it is that selfishness that precipitated a fall or a slide and such like that. When I say sinful, I mean intentionally working against the plan, and which is one of the only ways we can develop an independent freedom, which will later become a general freedom when it coalesces with the universe again. But I don't want to get into too many side trips. It'll be way too long. The mysteries were instituted for those of humanity that were capable of taking a central role, that is, of being leaders and teachers and examples for all the rest of humanity, and things were carried out through them, meaning to say that in every respect the divine intent is to have us become creative beings, and therefore we become reliant on ourselves and on our own in the whole process of evolution. We aren't just going through it as we would ride on some ride in a carnival or something like that, through the house of horrors. We're not just being carried through, we are making our way through, we are swimming through, and as much as possible, the responsibility for our part in fulfilling the intent of the evolution and fulfilling our part of the creation that evolution is expressed in is so that we carry it out on our own. So we come to the whole idea that we see throughout the material world. We've talked about it many times before, the idea of nucleus and field, that there is a central nucleus and that this central nucleus controls the general activity, whether it be in the nucleus of an atom or the nucleus of a cell or the nucleus of the solar system or in the nucleus of our consciousness. This is saying that in humanity, a nucleus of people who are willing to make great sacrifice and put forth great effort and to live extremely creative lives became people who instituted schools of mysteries that were based on the epitomal ideas of the evolution itself, and that by being in touch with them and bringing them into all the cultural vehicles through which we express, these beings became the leaders, and they are the source of the mystery schools. The mystery schools are schools that deal with the basic issues. What is a human being? Where did a human being come from? Where is a human being going? How did we get here? How do we get where we're going? And why? All of those fundamental issues. It involves where are we going? We're going back into the spiritual worlds, and the mystery schools teach us how to leave our bodies and how to function as free spiritual beings. Because of our fallen or retarded nature, the mystery schools were also agencies for human redemption. And they provided all kinds of means for humans to right themselves and retune into the cosmic path. The mysteries and the mystery schools were for exceptional people in other ways. They were exceptional in that they were people who were thinkers and active doers and creators and self-reliant. There is another class of humans that can be equally advanced but with a much different attitude. Those are people who are feelers and who are faith-oriented and are very much oriented toward authority. And that brings a potential contradiction in terms. So far we're saying that mystic in the generic sense means inward. Now we're using a different set of words. Those who are knowledge works, self-reliant. We could make a big, long list. In their basic orientation, the very advanced there are called occultists. Whereas those who approach by feeling, faith, authority, they are called, in a different sense of the word, mystics. We as students then of mystery schools are striving to become occultists, not in the sense now that it's associated with black magic and all that kind of stuff, but that is people who are trying to understand hidden things. The word occult means to hide, or it means hidden things. One of the things that we are doing as students of the mysteries, or as mystae, as we try to purify ourselves and try to become more sacrificial, is we are trying to realize the objectivity of inwardness. The funny thing is that most people associate objectivity with outwardness, and that has the least amount of objectivity. It's true that in some ways that you can weigh that chair and you can draw out its exact shape and such like that, but that is a very limited objectivity, and there's an ever-present subjectivity because you can only look at it from one point of view at one time. Whereas with the mystic kind of consciousness, you can view it from within or from all perspectives at the same time. But we're trying to develop an objective inward consciousness. We're trying to develop a unity of inward truth. And in that objectivity, we're trying to understand the emanation, or again, the life of that truth, like the life of the gods, and that is a universal language. The mystery schools have always taught that mythology is the last remnant of a universal language that speaks to all and that has to do with something that is in all of us. We will do a little bit more comparative mythology this time, and we'll see quite a bit of that. There are other things that are transcendent that have that same quality, not as much. Mathematics and music and things like astrology also come close to that universal language, but not quite in the same way that mythology does. Well, we're just about halfway through the notes. We'll make it in easily 75 minutes tonight. the mystery schools, being then in charge to some extent of the entire development of humanity as we go through life after life, have used the spoken language of mythology in several ways to attain various different types of ends. Early on, it was used to bring lessons to people with simple childlike stories and analogies, something that could capture the consciousness, and by carrying people along in the story, the life of the myth could be reborn in their consciousness, and they could get the idea of what they're supposed to do. To some extent, we find that in parables. Another way, and this is a way that we've been using it a lot, is that myths have been used to refamiliarize ourselves with the nature of the spiritual worlds. Because myths can be interpreted many ways, and spiritual truths are like good poetry, or like the Bible, or anything that is an expression of a spiritual truth. You can go back to it again and again, and each time you go back, you see a different side that you never saw before. What's that? It'll probably come through tonight. Myths are an excellent vehicle then, because they are so flexible, so that we can see a spiritual truth from many, many points of view. We have told some of the stories 2 and 3 times, and we're going to come back to Perseus at least one more time if we get the year beyond this year. And we're going to see it in another facet, and we're going to go back to stargazing one more time with that, at least. And it's also very good for, we've been studying, last year we spent quite a bit of time looking at Neoplatonistic interpretations of mythology, and myths are something that can be understood on different levels. And because they're flexible. Like if you look at a legal book is very, very materialistically literal. It can be interpreted one way. This is the intent of lawmakers, is to make it ironclad so that there is just one thing that you can get, and that it's clear what the law is and what it isn't. Myths aren't like that. They're capable of being experienced on different levels, because there's different levels of the spiritual truth. And the analogy that we talked about before, as above, so below, works perfectly in mythology. Another use of mythology has been to bring us comfort and inspiration in a very, very heavy world. Because the myths are still capable of containing divine truths in them, we can get the life from them, and we can be inspired to continue on, because otherwise we seem to become as stationary and dead as objects in the material world appear to be. We, among other things, have been seeking to understand the relationship of the many different points of view and the many levels of view in such a way that we are describing the spiritual worlds in the order of relative importance. And that brings us to where we are now, and that is with hierarchy. But we'll review everything we've done, and then we'll move a little bit into the introduction of what we're doing now. It was 4 or 5 years ago that we began this whole general series of talks. And we began with 2 talks that introduced the attitude that we were going to take toward mythology. The first talk told the stories of Lucifer and Prometheus. And they talked about the attitude of rebellion and independence rather than just mere acceptance. But the main idea that we got in the first talk was that from a spiritual point of view, the myths can just about be taken literally, because they're talking about gods, and they're talking about spiritual worlds, and they're talking about the relation of the gods to each other and the different realms to each other in such a way that we can begin to understand them in our soul. The second talk was a correction and showed that because we're in the material world, and when you focus here, everything gets turned upside down, and very often the myths mean just the opposite of what they say, and so we had a temporizing second talk. Then we went into a little sub-series, trying to remain practical. We went into looking at myths as formulae for living. And we took some of the creation myths from the Bible, and from Greece, and from India, and from the American Indians, and a little bit from Tibet. And in those creation myths, we tried to derive formulae that we could use for spiritual everyday living. Then we had another little sub-series on the whole idea of the spiritual life. That is, if the myths have always been in the hands of the mystics, that is, the students of the mystery schools, the actual myths that were used by the mystery schools themselves then became of central importance to how we live our lives. And then we talked about the myth of Isis and Osiris and how that fit into the initiations in the time of Greece and Rome and even into Europe. I'm finding now that the Isis myth was celebrated as late as the 12th century in places like Switzerland and Germany. Quite amazing. And then we looked at the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and we looked at the Eleusinian mysteries, and we spent about 2 or 3 talks on that. And then we looked at the myth of Dionysius, Bacchus, Zagreus, all as the same being, and looked at the Bacchic mysteries. And we ended up that year talking about the myth of Orpheus and the Orphic mysteries. Then we took a whole year of trying to understand what an initiate is, what an initiate does, how it is done, and why it is done by looking at heroes and at heroines. We took heroes and heroines everywhere from Norway to Japan, from Turkey to Greece, and we looked at all of the different things of initiation that we could with our semi-blinded state where we are at now. Having then looked at the mystery schools and what one does to be initiated, we are now in the process of looking at the mountain that we are trying to climb, and that is the pyramid of hierarchy. That in order to have a realization of the spiritual worlds, we must harmonize for the times that are now our inner cosmos to be a reflection of the greater cosmos. And to do that, we are trying to understand how to orient our values in a hierarchical structure so that when we live with a justice, to use the Platonistic sense, if we live with an internal justice that is a reflection of the cosmos, an understanding of the greater cosmos can be born in ourselves. And to do that, we have been studying several years the concept of hierarchy in the cosmos by looking at myths of hierarchy. We began the first sub-series was we looked at hierarchy in Hindu mythology. Unfortunately, Ela wasn't here for that, or she would have been cursing me every week. But as it is, she curses me in echo now. And we looked at the nature of divinity itself by the whole idea of gods. And we looked at the hierarchy in Hindu mythology, which is pretty non-hierarchical. It's pretty chaotic. Then we justified or rectified by going to the opposite extreme, and we went to a mythology that had an extremely rigid hierarchy, Egyptian mythology. We took quite a few side trips along the way. And then all of last year, we spent looking at hierarchy in Greek mythology by looking at 3 different cosmogonies, but we looked at all of them in the mystery schools from the attitude of the mystery schools of Greece, the Orphic mysteries. We looked at them with a Neo-Neoplatonism, Christian Neo-Neoplatonism. And we had a great time. We probably are not going to be able to maintain the level of sublimity that we had last year. It's not going to be that rare. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get that rare with my consciousness again. I'm coming to the age where I'm becoming a lump of an old man. Now we're ready for the next sub-series, and this is going to be on Northern European mythology. It'll be Teutonic, which means Germanic, and Norse or Scandinavian. We won't get any Slavic mythology in because there's not much Slavic mythology present, and you'll understand that in a little bit. The next step after this, which I don't think we're going to get to, this was meant to be an enormously ambitious thing, is to study non-mythical myths. That is, when we get to Norse mythology, we were going to get to the destruction of the gods and the dissolving of mythology, but to see how hierarchy was carried on in other things more closely approaching reality but still mythical. The idea was to look at myths in space, in matter, and in form. The space was going to be quasi-mythical, leading to mathematics. The matter was going to be in chemistry, in studying the periodic chart and its mythology. And the form was going to be for studying the taxonomical tables of the evolution of form as recapitulated on the Earth. But I don't know if we'll get a chance to do all of those things. And then we were going to look at it in time, again, in a quasi-mathematical, quasi-mythological spirit. We were going to look at astrology there in a hierarchical sense. And then I don't know how you'd say it, evolution of consciousness. That's enough. By studying angelologies. So I don't know if we'll get a chance to do all of those things. If so, it will probably not be all this year. As we treat Northern European mythology, we're at the last introduction. The whole talk is nothing but introductions. We're going to treat Northern European mythology very much the way we did Hindu mythology. It's going to be mirror image. We're going to end the way we began. We will introduce various divinities, and gods and goddesses and talk about their characteristics and then tell stories about them, and from that get an idea of the mystery philosophy along the way and of hierarchy along the way. Somewhere near the end, instead of doing a creation story, we're going to do the Ragnarok, which is the destruction story. And so it'll be mirror image, and we'll see how the cosmos ends. Somewhere in there, there's going to be a lot of synthesis and evolution of mythology, and also evolution of consciousness. But this year the talks may be interrupted from time to time because I have an enormous amount of preparation. I want to do a lot of comparative hierarchy ideas, and I'm really having too much to do. So occasionally I'm going to say there's not going to be a class next time, and then I'm going to have more time to do preparation. But for now, we'll just consider every other Thursday. No stories tonight. Instead, we're going to look at the cultural background of Northern Europe and the relationship of the cultural background very much the way that we did with ancient Egypt. But not as thorough as ancient Egypt, because ancient Egypt was probably one of the most minutely regulated and carried out to the nth degree societies that humanity has ever known. Whereas Northern European society, where the myths were born, was very, very much different. One thing that the Northern European mythologies have that are like all the other mythologies we have looked at, and that is that they are monotheistic, in that all of the gods and other beings exist within a one being. I don't know of a single mythology where that isn't present. Very often, the one being was esoteric, most likely because a lot of people couldn't understand that idea of a general unity and were more equipped for dealing with specialization. Also because specialization was the word of the day in the material world. The material world is the world of details and separations and carrying out separations in such a way that that is our work, to look at things in the little sense. Also, like all the other mythologies we've looked at, the step between the supreme being, the one being, and all of the other gods, so to speak, is a giant step. It's an enormous difference to say God, or rather than to say something like Wotan. An enormous difference. It is anyway, any time that if you just think of yourself, or just in your consciousness, think of oneness, and then just think of two, so that the oneness is divided within itself, you've had at least limited by half. You know what I'm trying to say? In a mathematical, the jump from 1 to 2 is an enormous giant step, and that's true in the consciousness that the Northern Europeans had about their about divinity in general versus gods within it. The evidence is right in the culture itself. In as far back as you can go into the language or into any representations of divinity, it's always in a oneness. But there is one thing that comes out different in Northern European cultural vehicles that didn't come out in any of our other studies, and that is the more the Northern European language is developed, the Teutonic and the Slavic both, there was the introduction more of the neuter noun, meaning to say that they had masculine and feminine, just like all of the other cultures. Some of the other cultures had the neuter also, but not as much. But the big difference is that the one in Northern European mythology is neuter. God is an it. God is not a he. God is not a she. It is all of those, but it is an it state that is as much beyond he and she as one is beyond two. It has that type of quality. As the years go on, in the inward trying to unite and awaken to the consciousness of God, that is ever more appealing to me experientially. That the idea of gendering God is absolutely foreign to my consciousness. I can do it as an intellectual activity, but spiritually, experientially, to think of God as male or female is almost like a blasphemy of, like saying God is a totem or something like that. As we've been saying, spirit is objective, and in that objectivity, it is impersonal. We have evidence of that in the Bible, where it says God is not a respecter of persons. So it is in that kind of impersonal oneness that the distinctions can derive with an equal emphasis without being unjustly played by favoritism or something like that. You know what I'm trying to say? That with the neuter type of consciousness, if one precipitates creations within without a intentional focusing toward one whole or another, or toward one of many qualities over another, it gives a balanced and full view of things. Like a painter cannot be a reasonable painter if that painter has a favorite color or a color that it doesn't like, because there will be something biased, there will be something skewed. And it's hard to conceive of something like a rainbow where one color is much more intense and saturated than the other colors. And it is this unity of consciousness that has that impersonal objectivity that allows this to come about. This doesn't mean that Northern European cultural vehicles and mythology were more advanced than any of the others. But there is something new. You can say advanced in a different way. Not better, but newer. It comes out just the same way that a later edition of a book is likely to have a different emphasis. If you go back and look at school books for 6th grade on George Washington from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, they'll each be different. And the newer ones will have more and hopefully more modern information in them. Now, this objectivity may not just be because it was a society and a culture and mythology that was developed later in the game. It might be just because Northern European culture is northern. different cultures are vehicles that are like tools. And the cultures are different than the beings that enter into those cultures. The beings are gods and are like God, and in that way they are universal and they are capable of all of the things that the divine is capable of. But they require experience. And in the material world and in the world of separation, that experience is not simultaneous as it is more in the spiritual worlds, but it is more linear. And so the experience is brought to us by being incarnated in different bodies, in different cultures, and we learn specific kinds of lessons from being born in one culture and then another and then another and then another. It's almost like a process of dyeing a garment in order to get a color that you want, or dyeing an Easter egg, one color after another, and it gives you the end result. It's very important to distinguish the vehicle from what uses the vehicle. The vehicle may be crude, it may be sophisticated. The vehicle may have about it some very unnice things, but the spirit is still of God. And it's really important that we identify, as spiritual students, that we identify the spirit that enters the form or the formation and keep that separate from the formation, because otherwise we're very likely to get attached to things, or we're likely to repulse things because some of the experiences are not pleasant to us, and that leads to all kinds of racism and things like that, which we're not trying to do at all. The earth itself is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for our evolution. It's a vehicle for creation. We're all creating in it. Right now we're creating too many highways, but that's that's one of our excesses we have to learn along the way. But it's a vehicle, and even for it just being a ball, it is important. Its geometry or its geography is significant, because the geometry and geography lead to different kinds of climates. And clearly the north is different than the south. You know, none of us want to be blasé Californians, where we can be out in the warm sun every day and we don't take life very seriously. We like the rigor of being up north. But whether we know it or not, where we are on the earth affects us in ways that we would never, ever believe. This is where Ila becomes very instructional in the class. If you look at Ila's notes, they are doodles. And do you know that people have done experiments with doodling? And what they do is they put people in rooms with pads to doodle on, and then they change the environment of the room where the people are in. And they find that if they make the atmosphere of the room more moist and more warm, the doodles become more curvilinear. When it becomes more cold and more dry, they become more angular and sharp and rigid. And so the objectivity, when we're talking about the neuter of the one of God or of the Supreme Being as being very objective and impersonal, that kind of objectivity that has its coolness about it is very much has to do with the fact that it developed in the north. And it's saying like this can best be developed in a northern culture and in a northern society. And until we're completely free individuals, and we're completely free individuals, we'll be able to do magic. And if we're able to do magic, we can overcome any kind of environmental or climatic condition and be whatever state we want to be, irrespective of externals. But it works both ways. It was important that the later of the Indo-European streams of evolving myths and vehicles for spiritual unfoldment, that it was important that the later ones, which came later in time, were developed more northerly, because then there was enough experience for the kind of objectivity so that there could be an appreciation of that facet of God and of our own being, which was not possible when we were young and, very subjective. Little children have to have more heroes, or they have to have more protectors, and they can't take an objective, like I said. All right. So there is an impersonality. Time has something to do with it too, but we're going to get to that in just a little bit. The northerliness is important for other significant differences in Northern European mythology. That is, India and Egypt, and to some extent even Greece, had mild climates. And they had usually fertile soil, especially Egypt. And so the struggle for the basic necessities of living was much less in those climates than what it was in Northern Europe. You don't do much sunbathing in Norway. It's just not much of an option. But these, what? Yeah. The differences are not all bad, though. We can't just say that living in a warm climate is better. There's something to the vigorous northern living. Paracelsus said it really nice, and says, the man who sleeps on a mattress can never know the joy of sleeping on a bed of needles or a bed of leaves. That there's something about sleeping out in the fresh air. I've done it a few times completely in the fresh air, just laying out there. It's a really nice experience. And there's something to be said for the fact that people who belong to polar bear clubs have, pretty vigorous health. So, when we look at the manifestations of mythology working into culture, especially in religion, like if you look at Egypt, or if you look at India, or even looking at the Parthenon, all of those places have great temples. You don't find any in Northern Europe. What there were instead there were sacred hills, or there were sacred groves, or sacred caves, or sacred springs. Occasionally they had things, temporary hogan-like structures, and sometimes they had tent-like structures, but very, very rarely that they had temples or churches, even until quite well along. So it was a very physical style of life. It was vigorous and rigorous, and it was close to nature. But in its closeness to nature, it was quite different from other societies that were really close to nature, in that even in tribalistic states, there was fierce independence. For example, comparatively speaking, the nature, culture that is the Native American society, there's not nearly the emphasis on independence as there was in Northern European. So as a result, the myths are found in nature things. I don't know how to say it. there is the doctrine of correspondences, which is a really direct way of dealing with as above, so below. It has to do with rulerships. And to the Northern Europeans, various trees were ruled by various divinities, and the qualities of those trees represented the qualities of the gods. And so that an affliction of a given type that resulted in such an illness could be remedied by applying to another god and applying the leaves from a given tree or something like that. The herbalism, but the representation of the divine in correspondences in nature, especially as nature powers, were much, much stronger in Northern European mythologies than in the southern mythologies that we've looked at so far. Animals, even more so, were seen as divine expressions. They were seen as vehicles even more than the Vahans of Hindu mythology. In some cases, they were seen as literal materializations. And they weren't looked at in a way like the Greeks used to sacrifice them and look at the intestines, or they weren't looked at as omens even, but they were looked at more as expressions of divine character. Like looking into the face of a wolf was like looking into the face of a god. And sometimes there was even direct communication in some almost mediumistic-like way, that people talked not in an omenological way or not in a divinational way, but they talked directly to the animal spirits and got the information. This is really ironic, and this is a source of a great misunderstanding, because Native Americans, for example, when they are bitter about the influence of Europeans and European culture on them, they blame the unnatural ways of Europeans as being unwholesome, without realizing that the roots of the two were much, much closer than between any two other societies on the surface of the earth. That the North American Indian and the Northern European, the attitude toward nature or the interaction with nature was very much similar. However, I found out it doesn't pay to bring this up in discussions with bitter Native Americans, because it sometimes gets rather volatile. You don't want to fight with anybody anyway. Despite all of these rough and ready circumstances of living, all of the higher sentiments were present, and in some ways were intensified. There was a great deal of faith, a great deal of sacrifice, adoration, submission, confession, and thanksgiving. All of those were in the sentiments. Even though they had wild and woolly lives, all of the characteristics were there. And it wasn't just a dog-eat-dog world. In fact, in some cases, they were taken to extreme. They had really interesting notions, like rape was utterly taboo. And if somebody raped somebody, and suppose they did it suppose it was a shepherdess that was raped, every animal that beheld that rape had to be beheaded. That severe it was, because it was considered such a defilement, such a human defilement, that the woman who was raped had to be protected from, or in some ways that defilement had to be expunged, and every animal pretty severe. That's a really interesting thing. Art relating to mythology and religion was not very strong either. Most of the art was either found in very domestic things, even not so extensive in the domestic things as in Greece. And again, it was more verbal. further we go, the more verbal it gets and the less pictorial. The equatorial mythologies are more pictorial, and these are more verbal. So there were a lot of lays and sagas and eddas and such like that that would go on and on and on, almost like this talk. Are we going to make it in? We're going to make it in. That far. Oh my cow, it's taking longer than I thought it would. There are almost no statues or no icons. It just wasn't in the character. It all goes with this very objective kind of consciousness. Now, this doesn't mean that they were incapable of it, because actually the character of the cultural vehicle was highly intellectual. And the potential of that, especially inductive intellectuality, was probably even greater than that of Greece. So we want to look at that a little bit relative to time, because that's important, because what we're going to see in Northern European mythology is much more crude than what we saw before. So let's go so below as above. Go from bottom to top. In a garden, there are various different types of plants. Some plants bloom at a given time of the year, no matter when they were planted. Some will only be in the ground maybe 3 weeks, and if it's their time of the year, they will bloom. Some plants bloom at n number of days, no matter when they're planted, except if you plant them too late in the season, then they may not have a chance to reach that number of days and come to bloom. All plants take some time to build to blooming. Some plants bloom and are done. Some plants bloom and start going to seed, and if you stop the seeding process, they will bloom again. And yet other plants bloom continuously once they begin. Cultural vehicles, just like plant vehicles, follow similar principles. Usually cultural vehicles are like the n number of days. A society with its language, its food and everything, its mythology, grows, develops, and then goes into decadence. The best example we have of that was Greece. Some plants, like strawberries, have a second season. And that's sort of like Rome, where it came up to a height and then it went into decadence and then there was a renaissance. Under very propitious living conditions, where the climate is mild and where there is a long period of time to develop, a plant might bloom and bloom and bloom again. That's something like the way India is. Egypt probably has the longest period of blooming of any cultural vehicle that we've looked at. And that's sort of like the kind of plant where it goes to seed, and you stop the seeding process and it starts all over. Remember when we discussed, for those of you who've been here other years, we discussed the period of recensions. They started all over from scratch again for reasons of religious power from time to time in Egyptian mythology and religion. Northern European mythology represents a different kind of interruption, not the interruption that is of stopping the seeding and producing new blooms. I have some poetry that I brought along. I don't know if you want to hear any poetry at this time. John Milton, who is not the most open-minded person, wrote an ode and a hymn on the morning of Christ's nativity. But I want to read just a very few lines out of it. Here it is. And this is something, though John Milton is writing about it many years later, it's talking about the nativity of Christ, and it goes into everything from astrology and Christian mythology and pagan mythology. Here it says, "The oracles are dumb. No voice or hideous hum runs through the arched roof in words deceiving. Apollo from his shrine can no more divine. With hollow shriek the steep of Delphos is leaving. No mighty trance or breathed spell inspires the pale-eyed priest from the prophetic cell." It's a idea that at the time, or around the time of the birth of Christ, all of the oracles, generally all over the world, went dead. Not the things like mediumship and such like that. This is agreed upon. It's talked about by pagan classicists. What happened here that all of the oracles went dead? They couldn't relate it to Christianity because they weren't in touch with that move. What is talked about here is a major change of phase in a larger cycle, and a major change of phase that is something like sunrise or sunset. In this case, sunrise is probably better. I don't know if you've ever camped out and woke up before dawn in the summertime. It can get pretty chilly. And you're around a fire and you're trying to keep warm, and you can't do it because the side of you that isn't facing the fire, because the fire's direct heat, gets very cold. And you watch the rosiness of dawn grow and grow and grow, and suddenly that one little slice of sun is there, and there's a dramatic change. There's a dramatic change in the light and in the general warmth. And that is a major change of phase. And this is so major that if there are other things going on at the same time, that those vehicles or those cultural vehicles have a very great change of activity also. Now we're talking about evolution now. We're talking about things that go over millions of years. But even so, if we take it in terms of several thousand years, it still makes a difference. There is a dramatic change as a result of this phase change that can be found in a number of ways in society. In general, previous to this, societies were broken up into diversity and specialization. That people were extremely tribal, or they related to one god, and they recognized and they were respectful of the people who were of another ray, but it was very, very special. There was also a shift from an externally controlled collectivism, that instead of the king or somebody like that representing all of society and having very hard-bound religious codes and such like that, more and more, ever since that period, individualism is becoming stronger and stronger. And then some of the other phase changes that we've been talking about all evening is that there was a shift from indirect symbolic experience to more direct experience, especially in material things, because science is one of the consequences of that. Religious things also. First, a shift from beliefs to principles, and then from principles to a general truth. So that the changes in society from 2000 BC to from 0 AD to 2000 AD are much greater than the 2000 years BC, because there's a dramatic change. We are not going to go into the Christ mystery right now because it's an enormous subject, but and a very, very touchy one. But so there is this dramatic change. There has been a major emphasis wherein all of the whole ideas of the ancient laws and the way that we looked at things before has been changed. Everything is being looked at in a new way. Now, because we as humans are still pretty primitive yet, we're still pretty savage, these changes have come about, and they haven't always come about pleasantly. But they have come about certainly. It's taken longer for them to be felt where the cultural differences are the greatest. That is to say that in the European societies, it didn't take that long. But it took quite a few years before I was introduced to China or India. And there isn't a continent in the world now, or people anywhere in the world of any cultural vehicle, that would deny science. Because it's an irreversible change. We know certain things about ourselves, about the nature of the world, and our ability to change them. Greece, now everything has its cycle. Greece was allowed a very graceful development over hundreds of years. It started as a very pastoral society, and people developed more and more agriculture, and the society, the commerce became stronger and stronger, and the society really developed all along. And the sophistication of the understanding of the myths went side by side. The ancient folk tales and the almost incomprehensible myths became more and more sophisticated to the point where they were understood as in Neoplatonism, where we saw last year that they were very, very sophisticated understandings of it. At the end, when Greece went into decadence, the people no longer believed in their gods and no longer believed in their religion, and floundering for something, they were afraid to take the new step, that was Christianity, but for the most part, they went back to things like Mandeanism and Mithraism and things like that. Very often there are things like societal regressions, just like there are individual personal regressions. But Northern European mythology wasn't afforded that slow, graceful development that Greece was. So what we're trying to say, this has been one of those terrible pictures again, but if there is something that is spiraling forward like this, and it has as its core a general central, and suppose you can take any cycle and make a horizon in it, any loop of any cycle, then there are, on that cycle, there are subcycles. Greece is about like this, but I should have made this up a little higher. I will just change change. This is magic. We can change the ascendant. And this is the change of state in the major cycle was such that it came in Northern European mythology and cultural vehicles, which represents one of the loops on the smaller cycle when it was still on the increase. So it got clipped off. And so in many ways, the Northern European mythology never reached the sophistication and the religion that could have worked out of it, even because it is north, even though it is north and cold and short seasons and such like that, it still could have reached a great level of sophistication had it not been within the design of things that it gets clipped off in an early stage. And it's an interesting thing for the history of culture, because then the people like of Germany and Norway and Poland and places like that had to shift gears, that when the culture was coming to age, it had to shift mythologies. It had to shift from a mythology that had to deal with the gods and nature. It had to shift radically, so that when it has come into its prime, it comes into its prime in the Renaissance, when science is coming up, and so all of things become a different kind of mythological outlook, and the character of the people is very different, and the character of the experience of the divine is very different. So, in many respects, Northern European mythology and cultural vehicles are like a plant that has n number of days before coming to blossom, but planted too late in the season. It doesn't flower in the way that all of the previous ones before it had. Now, this is an enormous topic. It's not what we're dealing with at all, but it's an interesting thing that I just thought you might like to look into. And it's an interesting way of looking at our times, and you get some good historical insights out of it. So we find the character of the people being like the character of the mythology. They're very brisk Germanic Anglo-Saxons, they're scientific and they're technical, because we're going to see as we look at the mythology, it's a pretty technical mythology. It's very much related to science. But it's sort of like a primitive youth who is born to ancient ways suddenly being transplanted into a modern society. And so what happens is that the unity of the understanding of the one truth in which all the other principles are embedded, and out of those principles are all of the details of the worlds, that one truth as it is introduced to us as a concept, where it becomes ripe now for an exoteric monotheism, for the first time that it is generally agreed that the worship is of one divinity and that there has to be a truth that relates to everyone, which is what this last 2,000 years has been like primarily. This was brought about to people who were pretty primitive and savage. And so we have Christendom, as Islam later, expressing monotheism and the unity of truth at the edge of the sword. And both of these religions are religions that destroy any of the differentials. Like they tried to destroy, take the Easter Island statues. All of the literature that was on the Easter Islands is no longer around. Either that or it's hidden in the Vatican somewhere, because it was considered sinful and heretical. The same thing with all of the literature from the Aztecs and Mayas and such like that. Of course, there's all pictorial literature because they didn't have a written language. But all of the mysteries were destroyed, taken away, so that the unity could come about. It's a strange thing that almost all of the vestiges of Northern European mythology have been destroyed, with one exception, and that is in Iceland in about 1220. There was a man named Snorri Sturluson. And Snorri Sturluson, Iceland was was in the northernmost part of northern culture, European cultures, was the most highly developed. In fact, to this day, there is trilingual. Almost all Icelanders are trilingual, and they're all exceedingly well educated because they have those long winter nights. They've got to do something with them. They make hay while the sun shines, but they study a lot. Anyway, Sonori he recognized what was happening, and he was a bright, very literate man, and what he did is he recorded all of the Icelandic myths, which were very similar to the Norse myths, and which correspond to the Germanic myths. The only things that we have left are the days of the week that go back to the pagans. There are other things you can find them embedded in language and cultures and such like that. So a lot of, not only did it not get a chance to develop because it was overshadowed, or as you'd say, over-enlightened by something that superseded its development, but the manifestation of that supersession was extremely violent and destructive and tried to destroy all vestiges of any of the culture at all. So we're going to have to deal with just fragments, and what I'm going to be used as source materials, I have along all the source materials. For understanding in a very heavy way, this is a 3-volume set that is now put into 4 volumes. It's on the Teutonic Mythology by Jakob Grimm, one of the Grimm brothers. It's an enormously difficult work, and it's about 1,500 pages. And it's hard to get a hold of, and it's hard to read through. I'm gradually working my way through. I'm about half done, so a lot of the material that I would like to, that I'll get all kinds of exciting insights into, I'll never get into the course because the course will be done before I'm all finished. This is another Icelandic work. This is translated by 2 poets, Paul Taylor and W.H. Auden. And this is called the Elder Edda, which is called the Poetic Edda. It's not so good mythologically. It's a number of long poems. This is only selections from it. There are many, many poems in the collection, and they're all long poems, but they have more to do with the sociology than they do with the mythology and the spiritual life. The prose Edda, or the younger Edda, is the one by Snorri Sturluson. And if you can get a translation of that, they're hard to get a hold of. They're quite good. This is a book of modern mythology. It's in print, only the cover is different now. It's Gods and Myths of Northern Europe. We'll refer to it quite a bit because a lot of the stories are in there in a nice, simple way, and not with all of the things that you have to go through with Snorri. Other places where you can find good material are Tacitus, Cornelius Tacitus. I believe Pelican Books has a translation of his Germanicus, which is his history of the German wars and of the German culture. And there was a scholast who wrote in Latin called Saxo Grammaticus, that even harder to get translations, but he has quite a bit of Germanic things available. And then there is a Norwegian that is famous for his works on early Norwegian culture, and his name is called Lobeck, L-O-B-E-C-K. All these are pretty scholarly things, and they're pretty dry, and you have to work, except for Snorri, you have to work pretty hard to really get at the joys of the storytelling. They didn't have the poets and mythographers. All right, so next time we will be all set for going into stories and seeing what it awakens in us in the spirit, and we'll probably begin by looking at the character and 1 or 2 of the stories of Wotan, who the Norse call Odin. And that's it. 2 weeks. Yeah. Next week is, I don't know if you're interested. You've gone through the intermediate astrology, which is meeting next Thursday. If you're interested, you can come on through and look again. Tuesday? No. No, every other Thursday. On Wednesdays, I'm doing the beginning. the very introductory course. On the Thursdays that this class doesn't meet, I'm doing the intermediate, the one with the charts of Gandhi and Helen Keller and all of those. I'm sorry it was a little boring tonight.